Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Collier Bristow's US UK podcast, a series which dives into the deep waters of the UK US private client industry to uncover the pearls of wisdom with some of the best and brightest in the industry. If you're a regular listener to the show, please do leave a rating or review. It really does help us bump up those niche US UK tax podcast ratings. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ollie Cutting, a wealth manager at Maseco, a dual qualified and independent US UK wealth management firm here in London. Ollie's career has taken him from the mean streets of St Andrews and through what, looking at his online bio, looks about just about every department at Ernst & Young before safely landing in Maseco a few years ago. Ollie, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. What an introduction. Thank you.
the mean streets of St Andrews? Mean enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone mean on those streets.
Maybe the back nine. Today, we are going to be casting our eyes over to the US and considering the hypothetical individual who is thinking of coming to the UK, is, let's say, an American citizen, but has had the good forethought to want to approach a firm like Maseco to think about their investment management and think, what are some of the steps I should be ideally taking in advance of coming to make sure that my affairs, when we arrive this person in the UK, their affairs are as sort of efficient and effective as possible. And here in cue Ollie to provide us with all of that keen insight. So Ollie, I think I want to start right at the very beginning to say, let's imagine this client comes to you, they've rung up Maseco and they've said, I need to speak to someone about arriving in the UK. What are some of the things that you're looking for first? Where is your eye drawn first with these types of clients?
Yeah, it's a good starting point because I think it's very easy for someone during this type of transition to be really focused on things like, where am I going to live? How's my new job setting up? What is life like in the UK? Do they show NFL on TV? The important questions. But actually, if someone is encouraged to speak to a wealth professional, certainly if they're, a high net worth individual, quite often they can really safeguard against some quite sizable, particularly tax traps and perhaps legal traps that you know more than I do about, if they take certain steps in advance. And I think in the first instance, we really want to make sure at Maseco that we conduct a thorough fact-finding process. We get to know the clients, what their values are, and essentially what sort of structures do they have in place for the time being. It might be that they've had some fantastic advice over the years from a US-centric wealth management practice or bank who have put in place all kinds of great products, which might be very tax efficient for a US taxpayer whose only filings are to the IRS. And so on that point, I think one of the early discussions is around, what sort of citizenships do you hold? If, for example, someone in the States had married a Brit, then it may be actually the triggers that move the British spouse onto perhaps the global basis of taxation in the UK might come quicker than for an incoming non-dom American. And so in some cases, that's a consideration, and that might warrant treating their assets separately, for example.
I think that sort of shows the key first parts to this, like with any sort of client scenario, be an accountant with a lawyer, with a wealth manager, is that you're never going to find a one size fits all policy. Your client who's married to a Brit, they may have small children. We may be in a sort of high growth phase of their life. They may be looking to grow what is a small capital basis, but, need, income slightly less, although maybe if they've got kids, they've got to be funding school, for example. But that presumably is quite different. And your objective-based planning is quite different than if these are retirees who are happy to spend down the capital because they don't need as much sort of as of a nest egg sort of put away. So that presumably is also a key part of any sort of approach, is an objective-based approach and then working backwards from there rather than saying, where can I save some tax? Am I sort of on the mark?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely on the right lines there. One of the fundamental issues which we look to solve is making sure that any investments, for example, that are in place are as tax efficient as possible from a US and UK standpoint. Certainly, if someone's exposed to paying taxes on those assets, for example, in the UK, and then trying to offset those with their IRS returns. But I guess in amongst all that is back to basics, cash flow planning. What's your income position? What will your income position be when you're in the UK? And effectively, how much cash do you need to bring into the UK in sterling, or set aside, or try and remit? And perhaps there are tax implications of doing so, in order to essentially make sure that you're safeguarded from meeting your liabilities in the UK. On that point, you raised something there about the kids, for example, and education savings. And again, it's about making sure that certain structures that have perhaps been put in place or planned to put in place for inheritance planning, or even to support education spend in the future, still work from a UK standpoint. I guess we're all basing this on the assumption that someone may move to the UK and stay here for long enough that they end up being subject potentially to sort of both the UK and US tax regimes.
Yeah, but equally, I mean, I don't think it's a poor question to ask. Certainly from the lawyer's perspective, it's an incredibly important question to ask. How long do you intend to spend in the UK? Because the client that's going to spend less than 12 months here may not end up resident at all, depending on how they sort of their period here falls with the tax year. If it's 1 to 2 years, it's not impossible. I don't know if they're going back and forth between the US and the UK. They might be treaty resident under a double tax treaty we have, say, with the US. If they're coming here with kids that are 4, 5, 6, 7, and they're looking to put them into the education system here, my brain's going, are you here for 10 to 15 years? Because 10 to 15 years then puts a sort of spectre on the horizon of the deemed domicile rules after 15 years of residence. So certainly the planning, the legal, the structural planning that I'm thinking about for a client absolutely depends on how long they're going to be here, because some of the larger, more long-term planning it might work, but it's disproportionately costly for someone that's only going to spend a few years here. And presumably it's the same for your clients. You could undergo a great exercise. We'll come on to what some of those ideas might be, but you could undergo a great exercise to cleanse their portfolios of some of those lovely, lovely investments that managers like you like to talk about. But frankly, if they're only going to be here for a short period of time, you might just ride that for a couple of years or take a more proportionate approach.
Exactly. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's all about how much do you actually need to free up to potentially bring to the UK in the future. And, if you're staying here forevermore and you've decided, I'm really not a fan of the States anymore and I'm moving across, I would say wait until you see the weather in London or Edinburgh.
What's the expression one of my colleagues says? One of my colleagues says to Americans, if you like cold summers and warm beer rather than warm summers and cold beer.
That's a great line. Fantastic. I'm going to steal that one, of course.
Feel free. This is going as a podcast. I think everyone can use it from now on. Yes. It depends. Equally, as you say, we will all undoubtedly have known people who also, they say, I'm going to come here for 2 years. It's only 2 years. I'm coming for a 2-year secondment. And then they come here, they meet a man or a woman, or they have some children, or they buy a house. And they think, actually, I tell you what, it's not so bad, this whole London stuff. And then you're saying, well, I wish you would have told me that before. So like me, I presume you would also take a cautious approach to these things. If in doubt, let's overplan, because you'll thank us for overplanning when you come to, like I said, work out how lovely the UK is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of our role as wealth advisors or advisors in general is to sometimes ask the more difficult questions, or at least get the ball rolling with thinking about some of these topics. I mean, it's always quite funny in a sense, meeting someone who maybe has no kids, but they're sort of planning on it. And they hint at that. And you say, well, do you see your kids going to school in the UK? Sometimes it can be slightly daunting, and you're not sort of holding them to an answer, but it at least gets people thinking about, okay, actually, especially as someone with wealth in a number of different pots and types of accounts, the more foresight I can have, and therefore the better a picture I can build for my baseline for the next 10, 15 years, the better advice I'm going to get in return, because you and your team can start to really map out, not just this is what we think is the best plan, but here are some options, and what that might look like for us is around, as you say, you might want to go through an exercise where you liquidate a number of investments, realize again, perhaps remit some of those proceeds to the UK, maybe even be subject to a slightly higher rate of tax. But if that ties into a wider plan of actually we see ourselves buying a home in the UK in X number of years, or we're looking at expensive schools for the kids or whatever it might be, it may well be the best thing to do. Or even aside from that, the crux of this is that obviously not every investment that exists in the US works from a UK standpoint, and vice versa. In fact, the options are perhaps even more limited if you convert all those US assets to sterling, bring them into the UK and walk down the high street looking for someone to invest your money for you.
Definitely.
Although we do have some neat solutions for sort of sterling exposure in US accounts and things. Again, it's very much based on intentions for the future, because if you imagine you're invested and you may have some embedded gains in those investments, you expect them to grow, or you hope that your account's going to grow over time. And it's about looking at how efficient from perhaps a UK tax standpoint that growth actually is. And if it's going to cost you an extra 20+% on the gains tax to sell those in 10 years' time, there may be an argument to say, look, it might make sense to liquidate some of these, pay some tax now. Tax isn't always the enemy, right? If it's proportionate and you pay the right rates and you're paying tax on growth. But then perhaps rearrange your investments into funds or other products that are tax efficient from both an IRS and HMRC standpoint. Even sometimes if that account is not immediately being subject to UK taxes, it means that at least you're building up capital gains, which you're quite confident should be taxed appropriately in the future if you ever had to access those funds.
I do think sometimes that I imagine in your profession more than certainly mine, and perhaps even less the accountants, there's a great psychology that comes to the work that you do about managing clients and their expectations of money, growth, tax, immediate tax versus future tax, current growth versus future growth, and saying tax on growth means you've grown. And the old adage of not letting the tax tail wag the dog is one that we use probably too much in my industry. But this idea that these are all things that need to be managed, expectations as well as your portfolio, and helping clients. I like to think of you guys as, you're the dream makers. You're the ones that are actually realizing the funds. We're just here to sort of put a curb on it and tell them bad news. But you guys are the ones who are sitting down and saying, what income do you want? Where do you want to see yourself? If you're currently invested in largely illiquid stock, then your options may be more limited than if you're invested in high income producing stock, or if you've got a client who has always spent their entire life running their own business, but their capital is tied up in the value of their business. Well, what does that look like if they're looking to transition out of that and into a slightly easier life? Interpretation I've always put onto your industry is that it's kind of good information in, good analysis in, good numbers in, good numbers out. If clients can come to you with a really thorough, clear set of assets, of proposals, of objectives, and I imagine most importantly, with enough time in advance of them coming, then what they get out of it is a beautifully crafted model that says, here's what we can do for you. Here is where the money is. Here is where the growth will be. Here is the money for your children. Here's the money for your retirement, as opposed to a half-baked plan out of which comes a soggy mess.
No, you're spot on. And obviously it's great to work with clients who, even on a simple level, kind of budget, their expenses. They have a really good handle on what does a good lifestyle look like for us in terms of month to month spends. What is our likely income profile? But I think we don't put so much onus on the client to go away, put together a load of information and come back to us with it. We want to also be able to guide them on that journey, because we're also comfortable working with people who haven't really thought through, they might be high earners for whatever reason, but they could be an artist or a musician and not really have any real interest in investing, but they see the worth in doing so, and they're told it's a great idea. We see ourselves in part as educators on that side. And also, as I say, it's about having the right systems and processes in place where, by asking a number of smaller questions and requests for information around what they have and what their ambitions are and all the rest of it, as you say, we can start to build a really good projection of okay, well, based around various assumptions or projections on effective taxes and interest rates and inflation, which we won't talk about today, we're able to give them a robust idea of where they might be in 5, 10, 15 years. And that allows us to then make more informed recommendations around, okay, well, based on that, perhaps the currency you want to spend in, this is how we think you should shape your investments. And a piece beyond that we again sort of touched upon there around psychology, I think what also comes into that is risk.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And one of the benefits of really getting a grasp for future projections and cash flow planning, where might this family be in 10, 15 years, is that if you marry that with a real understanding of their propensity for risk and how they feel about investing and past experiences and ambitions, and what in their eyes is a good level of net return, and you marry these things together, it's a nice feeling when you're able to show someone, okay, do you know what? Actually, so long as your projections are relatively accurate, you don't need to take too much risk. But actually, you've said spouse A wants to take a lot of risk and adventure. Well, you can afford to do that because you're able to withstand more volatility than you thought you could before, for example.
We're going to take a little break now. In the interim, I'm going to ask Ollie how he's found risk analysis and loss aversion in 2022, and we're going to do it offline though. We're not going to subject him to that on a public podcast. When we come back, Ollie and I are going to look towards those ideas or some of the ideas that we really would like to get in front of before someone comes to the UK, because there are more opportunities there. We might also look to those clients who have already landed at Heathrow and stepped off the plane and gone straight down the road to Maseco's offices. What is still left open for us? I do hope you will join us next time. Thank you very much.